Hey everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the systems that I've already got out here on my bench are the African night crawlers, the ones that I received from Northeast Worms. That's why I've got the Northeast Worms sticker on there. And it's only the bin with the worms in it that I've got the sticker on. The other bin is actually the material that those worms used to inhabit up until 8 weeks ago, 56 days ago, when they were moved over into this new container here. I held on to their finished castings rather than taking them straight out to the garden, with the assumption that there's cocoons in there. And after 8 weeks, you would have to think there must have been some progress. So I think we're gonna take a look. We're gonna see how things are in there and make our decision on what to do next. So let's get to work. We're starting here in the cocoon nursery. The castings, basically, the castings that were taken away from the worms when the worms were moved out. And they're not the sort of castings that you would consider to be like those beautiful, impressive castings, black gold. I mean, technically they're black gold, but they're wet black gold. And the excess wetness, moisture, is what's causing this clumpiness, which we've had in here since day one. We've always observed all that moisture, and a lot of my systems were exhibiting excess moisture. And in those systems, I took steps to allow drying, possibly not covering up as thoroughly, perhaps leaving the plastic coverings pulled back from the edges a bit here and there. I'm tempted just to start pulling worms out because ultimately that's the main reason for keeping this material around. It's a nursery, but it is castings that are destined for use in the garden. So the aim is to collect worms from this material before we use it for that ultimate purpose. If we're going to plow through this material and inspect it, do I hang on to worms? You know what? Let's skip that. That's just going to increase the complexity of our whole mission here. I guess my whole mission here is to get a sense of whether it's time to start trying to migrate worms out of the material. All those worms we saw right there, it seems doubtful that they would have been worms that were born here in the bin, but as you start bumping into somewhat smaller worms, like the one that I've got here on my finger, he looks pretty puny. He, she, whatever. I don't think you can call them either way. I don't think they have a preferred pronoun. So it is really the smaller sized ones I'm more interested in observing to see, is there a prevalence, is there, basically evidence to show that the cocoons that were assumed to have been in this material have produced a new population of baby worms that are worth rounding up. And I think in general, I see good sized worms and they're probably easily visible on the camera, but I'm also seeing probably just as many small sized worms. So I think after 56 days, the time has come for us to get the migration of the worms out of this material started. I guess there's that whole concept of no more waiting, let's get the show on the road. No waiting, only catching up, right? The slow pokes that can't keep up will be left behind. So yeah, I've got all my stuff over here on the other end of the table ready to go in preparation for setting up a migration of the worms out of this material. So we're going to have to create enough space in here so that I could load it up with a nice fresh feeding area, some nice fresh bedding for them to be drawn into. When I look through this stuff, it just seems so loaded with bits of bedding, paper, probably food scraps. I'm even wondering if a migration of these worms would be possible out of this stuff, since this stuff is so heavily stocked with all the things that the worms could possibly ever need. What's going to be their motivation? Do we really follow through with migration, or do we need to rethink this? Okay, I've gathered my thoughts, and it consists of at least reaching some goals with this cocoon nursery, short-term goals. Number one is going to be drying, I think. At this point, all this moisture is excessive. My reason for keeping it this moist all this time has been the fact that it is a cocoon nursery. Dampness is needed to enable cocoons to hatch. So I think we've given that enough of that over 56 days. So it's going to be drying, meaning no more plastic covering. That's going to be the one major change here today. Last time too, I think we'd already treated the system with some BTI, but rather than adding it to the bedding or the material directly, you know, since drying is our goal, since the plastic's going away, I'm going to upgrade it to just a sheet of paper, newspaper covering at this point. So we'll take that tattered, really, you know, broken up, torn piece of paper that was covering underneath the plastic before, drape it out here, and then on top of that we'll go the new covering, and that should pretty much thoroughly cover the entire top. And that water that the newspaper replacement covering newspaper is soaking in is that BTI solution. And you know, getting that BTI solution treatment in here was also one of my goals. And you know, I'm also kind of teetering on possibly reinstating the application of this white powder that you see out on the edge. I had sort of transitioned over to using only the BTI solution in the hopes that it might knock out the insects, but you know, if the diatomaceous earth is also helping achieve that goal, then maybe going back to the old 1-2 approach would be worthwhile. But let's get this whole thing set so we can return it to the shelf and let it continue, and then, you know, maybe at least in the short term, now that we've addressed getting BTI in here and how we're going to achieve that, the next, you know, I think milestone for this system is going to be to achieve a degree of dryness and I guess more manageability basically of this material here, because right now this material is just clumps. And usually clumps of material makes me nervous because it gets really nasty and anaerobic, but none of this seems that way. It doesn't really make me nervous at all, so I'm not worrying about it. Just wondering about some of these doubled up spots where the moisture is not going to be able to exit the bin quite as readily. Just wondering if we could somehow maybe even put it in a crumpled state, leaving air gaps beneath it, eliminating the doubled layer setup. And then that piece of dampened paper that's going to cover things here, that's also going to go on as just a single sheet. It's got no folds, or, well, right now it is folded just so I can drop it into the BTI solution. But I'll just unfold it and put that down here as a single layer as well. Well, we're pretty much trashing this poor piece of paper. I was even tempted to like sprinkle worm chow all over this paper, just to see if we can get a rise out of the inhabitants of the system and see if they'll come up to nibble on the stuff. But I'm still convinced that all these clumps of material within the castings is not just castings, but a whole bunch of other residual leftover bedding and food. And that's part of the other reason I'm thinking, unless we let this stuff dry to the point where it can crumble, it's going to remain locked up like that. The worms are going to feel like they're surrounded by a kind of an unending supply of bedding and food locked up in each of these little clumps, and they'll never want to leave. So I think up until we can get this stuff a little bit more granular, we're not going to be able to initiate any sort of next steps. Alright, so here goes the BTI solution. Really just going in as a soaked piece of paper on top, hopefully continuing with the elimination of the flying insects. It's not really supposed to kill the insects themselves, it's their larvae. So they'll be able to mate, produce eggs, but it's the larvae that emerge from those eggs that'll never be able to fulfill their destiny, so to speak. So this is my cocoon nursery of ANCs on day 56, transitioning from plastic cover to paper cover, hopefully initiating the drying of some of this material. Alright, let's move on to feeding the real worm bin. Okay, enter stage left. We've got our actual worm bin. Perhaps we can even Come in just a little bit closer with the camera for a better view of what's happening here. I guess in the cocoon nursery there wasn't much of a worm sighting opportunity. Perhaps here there will be. Let's get these coverings off the assortment of foods that I put together for them. Seems to have generated a little bit of a theme. It looks to me like everything they're going to be fed today needs to be in the category of round. Round coffee filter, round grapefruit rind, round top and bottom of a cantaloupe. The only stuff that's not round is stuff that's been hidden down below. Some lettuce. Alright, so let's see here. They've, I can't remember if this top covering newspaper was already this chewed up or if they've been doing this over the past couple weeks since we last checked in on them. These are African night crawlers, which are known to typically have a craving for the carbon-based bedding type things you normally put into the bin, sometimes appearing to even favor that stuff over your yummy kitchen scraps and stuff. But you know, with that cantaloupe and lettuce and everything, I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to sway them towards the kitchen scraps end of the menu. Not that it matters, they can eat whatever they like. After feeding, we had piled the top surface here with a whole bunch of this paper. Again, thinking that it's something that these particular types of worms might appreciate. The moisture in here is nice, definitely nice. Even out to the very, very edges where usually the telltale of whether or not the moisture level is decent is whether or not worms are occupying the space. And it seems like even right along the edges, our plastic covering must have been doing a very thorough job keeping the moisture down in here for these wormies. And that's great because they, you know, feel comfortable cruising every end of the bin, high, low, left, right, up, down, whatever. Not neglecting any part of the bin. And you can see a good amount of castings beginning to pile up down in here. Trying to think now, the only thing that rings a bell in my mind about the last feeding was that it just seemed skimpy, and you know, when I came to the realization that it's already been 2 weeks since that was put in here, it seemed unlikely that we'd see any leftovers of it, whatever it was. I think there was also citrus then. This time it's grapefruit, but I think at that point it was maybe orange peels or tangerine or something like that. And that's the sort of thing that sometimes doesn't get eaten right away, so we might see some leftovers of that. And I think what we're even seeing here is leftovers of the coffee. There's just something distinctly different about the way the coffee appears in a worm bin compared to the castings. Look at this, we've got an old mango seed in here. Worms hanging out inside of it, doing their thing. Alright, we're kind of just very randomly exploring this bin, checking out stuff, but I guess that coffee filter that we removed earlier that was draped out across the center here was indicating to us where we had last fed this bin, and it was down the middle as indicated. I'm trying to wonder what else, you know, coffee obviously, because it was visible as leftovers. And for whatever reason, just the orange peel rings a bell as something that was used as part of their last feeding, but if we don't find leftovers of it, it wouldn't be surprising, although I do feel like I'm catching a little whiff of it. A very gentle, subtle whiff of orange citrus. And could we have actually found a little fragment of it here? It's a good thing we found a piece because I spent enough time looking for it. The worms look pretty content hanging out down here, but as far as leftovers go, I don't know. Seems like they're doing a pretty good job with the feeding that they've been given. And it also seems like they've been doing a pretty good job on working down a lot of this surplus bedding that we added for them to play in. Because besides that stuff that we sprinkled out across the top like this, I'm pretty sure we had also laid down a pretty good size foundation of our feeding that we applied with fresh bedding in here. And I've got my fresh bedding all set to go. I've got my container of fresh bedding on the side here. So every now and then I want to just sort of plow through the material and get this sense of, you know, how much of it at this point after 8 weeks is still only bedding, or how much of it is actually turning to castings. Definitely seems like they're doing a good job filling the system up with castings. So yeah, these, I think this is another one, right? This ain't the one we saw earlier. This one feels a lot more worked, a lot lighter. A lot of castings in there, a whole bunch of worms in there though. So that's kind of interesting that those old remnants of some old feeding, or maybe even it's food that came over with the worms from their previous environment, I don't recall. But with that much breakdown, it does seem unlikely that they've been added to this bin as a feeding. It seems more like after 8 weeks that those mango seeds probably came over as sort of a transplant with the worms from their old environment as leftovers. Alright, I think we made a pretty good sized hole down in here, which means I think we could be pretty generous with the application of bedding. What do we got for these little guys? I guess not surprising, I've got my standard here, my prepared bedding, which we'll start with. We'll dump a bunch of that right here in the middle because that'll give me an opportunity to blend in this coffee and not leave it in a big pile the way we saw. Sometimes when I'm a little bit willy-nilly in terms of the application of the coffee, I don't pay so much attention, and then it ends up, you know, lingering. But if I spend just a couple seconds on this stuff to help it combine with something else, like the neighboring bedding or whatever is available, then I just get this sense that the stuff is, you know, maybe just blending in better, and maybe it's still there in just the same amounts of quantity. But I'd also like to think that just by blending it in this way, we give it a little leg up, you know, in the breakdown process. You know, and I'm bringing in some of these old pieces of paper. This old feeding zone indicator will now be replaced with a brand new one. And I'm even looking at that top covering piece of newspaper. I'm always a big fan of trying to see what I can get in terms of lifespan out of those top coverings. So even though it's pretty torn up and nasty looking, I believe we're going to stick with it, do our best to preserve its intact status, because even though it's got big holes in it and whatever, I would still consider it as intact enough to continue serving its original purpose. So I think we'll keep it for now. All that bedding I sprinkled down in there on the bottom just feels like I want to use something, because here too I'd like to include some of this BTI solution, and I think I'm just going to drizzle it right into this handful of bedding that I'm applying as I sprinkle it around. Drop a little bit in here too. In this case here, this system, you know, I don't think we're seeing a situation with excess moisture. I think everything's just fine here. It was just in the other container where I was a little reluctant to throw the moisture straight down into the material that we'd really like to see drying. This is crushed eggshell that you're seeing the ad here as additional food, and well, we're kind of running out of space, so let's get the last of the food that we portioned out for them into the bin here for them to nibble on. I'm still thinking though, before we pile in the last of this food, and there's still a good bit of lettuce here, I'm just hoping we're going to have enough stuff in the end to cover up with. It does seem like we piled a good amount of stuff over on this side. I'm just wondering if we can also come in with a little bit of this type of bedding too. Just to keep the carbon balance pretty good. I like putting in the kitchen scraps, but I also like having all the bedding nearby too if possible. So this lettuce here, this is not going to last. This is probably what they're going to tackle first. And then they'll be right there on top of the cantaloupe. That'll become another irresistible treat for them to hang out in. You'll be curious to see what the cantaloupe looks like next time we check in here. And I don't know, 2 weeks might be worthwhile to start thinking about coming back in here a little bit more frequently to see how things are progressing. I think we've got enough stuff over on this side to easily cover up our feeding area. It just feels like I sort of jumped to cover up, and I'm wondering if I've forgotten anything. Hopefully I've gotten everything taken care of here. I was going to bring in my leaves one more time at the end to help get this whole system once again set up with some surplus bedding. Last time it was just a bunch of this shredded paper laid out as a mound over here in the middle. I'm wondering if we would benefit from just doing that one more time before bringing the leaves in. Perhaps just one more thin coating of these nice pieces of paper, which I think are going to also serve well as another place for us to drizzle just a little bit more of this BTI in, so that if any bugs do wind up in here trying to camp out, hopefully the stuff does as it's meant to or hoped to, and prevent them from really thriving in here. So let's take some of this lovely fresh leaf covering and spread it out across the top. Stuff's going in dry. I don't think it's going to stay dry for long though. Here we're going to stick with the plastic coverings. I really like the way the moisture level in here is throughout the bin. Everything looks really nice in here. Worms are doing a wonderful job. My hope is that at some point soon we can pull babies out of that cocoon nursery, reunite them with their families, bring them into here, and then finally write off that batch of castings as done. Put them in storage, put them to use out in the garden, free up the bin that they occupy right now. Well, you know, as far as top coverings go, this piece of paper here might not be serving that purpose for much longer. Alright, I still got a little bit of BTI, but I think we've put enough of that stuff in here. I think we're just going to leave it at that, bring back our top covering, and call it a day. So that's where we stand now with my African night crawlers. This was their feeding number 4. And there again, 4 feedings over that much time. Probably wouldn't hurt to increase the frequency. Alright everyone, I'll talk to you guys later. I'm done here. I'm going to clean up and put things away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.